So GPT-4, I wanted to resist this topic, but I feel now is the time when we must
But
tackle it.
but how much?
We,
How much though? Really, did you want to
how much
resist
we need to
it?
tackle it, or how much orders this is fair. Like this is
The first one.
this is fair. Exactly. Well, in terms of resisting it, I have tried nothing and a lot of ideas. As my favorite clickable headline. Yes, I have tried to resist. I have tried to resist the prolonged discussion around. So GPT-4 came out last week. One of the things they have demonstrated is writing code with GPT-4, and people are naturally asking the question, what does this mean for software engineering? Well, actually, they're not asking that question as much. What they are asking, which I think is unfortunate, is what does this mean for software engineers, not for software engineering? It seems to me, and there is a lot of chatter out there. There was a Hacker News story, which I guess, Adam, did you miss this thing over the weekend? Do you close Hacker News over the weekend? I just admire your
That
right.
implies that I have it open during the week, and I
Oh
would
God,
say
stop it! Oh God,
that
twisting the knife. Oh my God. Okay,
I
look.
I have it open sporadically, and I definitely missed this Carmack tweet if that's what you're alluding to.
Okay, look, fine. Not only are you not at the bar, you don't even know where the bar is. Like, look, some of us never left. Okay, some of us like, I just need. Can someone call me a cab,
Look, I've,
please?
I've got my 2-year chip. I'm very proud.
Right, Josh. I think I'm talking to you. You and I are. I know Josh. Josh has only left the bar to go to go to the bathroom
For,
briefly. I know Josh and I are back at the bar. So
for a while, I had like a scraper that would write down all the stories that hit the front page, so that even if I wasn't there when they were on the front page, I could look at them later.
so I could actually get any drinks that were served in my absence. I could come back and consume. So in particular, John Carmack had a tweet where he had tweeted out a DM exchange that he had with a presumed human, but may not be, about why he felt software engineering still had a future, and what the role of software engineering is. Exactly right. And then there was a lot of discussion on hackers. Josh, did you? I assume you went into some of that.
I actually don't think I saw this one,
Oh
but I
God,
think I've seen 8,000 other things about
there's been a lot.
GPT-4. It was the
Yeah,
guy with
about
the
GPT-4.
$2 million or whatever that happened investing. Like, I'm just gonna have GPT-4 invest this or whatever.
Hold on? Are you talking about Balaji had the crypto bet last week? Are we like crossing the streams
Maybe
here?
I'm mixing two ridiculous
You
stories
are.
together.
I feel okay. Honestly, I feel like ChatGPT is writing Hacker News headlines for you. Is it possible that you are creating your own? Have you used ChatGPT to write your own Hacker News so you know you can just
Honestly,
control?
Brian, I'm not even here. This is a ChatGPT synthesis with a text-to-speech thing.
I knew it.
That's
I
why
knew
my
it.
accent is so weird.
Been fully automated finally. So, so in particular, this is, and a lot of people are talking about this, and a lot of people are talking about. Adam, I sent you that link to that paper about the jobs that will be affected by large language models. And I don't know if you got a chance to read that. I mean, it's.
Yeah.
And all of this is still very loose, but wanted to get your take on it. Wanted to get the collective your take on it. I wanted to offer a little bit of my own, and maybe I'm not going to be able to resist that long before I editorialize a little bit myself.
Yeah, do I have a not particularly hot take. I don't know if you want me to go first to give you some space to give a hotter take.
Yeah, if you could just give me some space for running start.
Yeah, exactly. So I've played with ChatGPT. I'm sure we all have. I think the thing that has been most interesting actually has been my wife's use of it at work. So my wife does shareholder activism stuff, in particular around environmentalism and CEO pay. And a lot of this time is spent groveling through these SEC filings where companies tried to obfuscate what they're doing. And she needs to there's a lot of manual labor associated with gathering the data and figuring things out. And she's been sort of testing ChatGPT as an augmentation of the stuff that she and her team do and been finding it alarmingly useful. Useful, not in a way that's threatening, not like in a way that she doesn't have a job, but rather in ways where they get to do the interesting parts of the job. So I thought that's been pretty wild. And then my older son, who's a high schooler, has been using it to write some graphics code and finding that pretty instructive. And me, the least productive member of the family, apparently, has been trying to get it to write episodes of The Simpsons that I wanted to exist but don't. And they're incredibly tedious and not funny, and feel very much like late 2000 mid 2000 Simpsons. So on the mark.
Well, this is going to be the reveal. The Simpsons predicted everything. In fact, they had GPT-4 in 2011.
Did you clarify the prompt? Like, look, no, write it like it's the 90s or whatever.
Right, like it's the 90s, not like the 2000s.
I kept on saying, like, okay, now imagine you were on the Harvard Review or the comedy magazine. I kept on asking it to make it funny, and it refused.
Did you tell it to imagine that it was a Gen Xer and not a millennial? That maybe that would actually.
Yeah, I'm not as good at like the hack prompting, prompt hacking. But
then you, my friend, have no future in software engineering, because that is all we're going to do. I'm afraid is prompt engineering.
I hate that we're calling it that.
Prompt engineering?
Yeah, I just don't like it.
Why don't you like it? Why don't you like prompt engineering?
I mean, my kid is not doing like finger painting engineering in the kindergarten. Like, it just feels like it's not really a field.
Are you? Well, boy, I would take that up with the school then, because my children are all finger painting at that age.
It is the Bay Area, I suppose.
Yeah. It was taught right after the entrepreneurialism class at preschool. I mean, come on,
God. No,
so Brian, what's your take on ChatGPT and GPT more generally?
So I think it's really, I mean, it's intriguing, and I think there are aspects that are really promising, but I have got a lot of questions, obviously. I think one of the questions that I definitely have is how it does in areas in which I have domain expertise, as opposed to where I'm kind of where it can kind of get away with bullshitting. And so, I asked it to write. Have you asked it to write any Detroit scripts, by the way?
I have, actually, yes.
And how'd it go?
It did very poorly, like either cribbed and answering a different question, or like didn't work.
I mean, very, very poorly is how it went. Very poorly, but with absolute confidence. And this is the Gell-Mann amnesia, where this is the physicist Murray Gell-Mann. Have you heard
right,
of this?
The newspaper thing, right? Where you like,
yes,
like if you know about a field and you read the newspaper, it's like you're horrified at how ill-informed it is, and then you'll read the next article about like complex geopolitics and be like, oh, all right, that makes sense.
That's how it is. And actually, this is the issue I had with Scientific American. Actually, great publication, but I was a Scientific American reader, and every article they had about software systems was atrocious, and it should not have been published. And I began to realize, like, should I be? And I'm pretty sure that I'm just going to assume, for my own sanity, that Scientific American was much more accurate and correct. That there weren't chemists and microbiologists that felt the same thing about their chemistry and microbiology articles. But I definitely have had that, and certainly with ChatGPT, when I've asked it to do anything, it was unbelievably bad. And I think the worst thing is that it was confident, and that I think that also, this is kind of the problem that I've had with this domain from the beginning, is the way it positions itself. And I think this is the danger of calling it artificial intelligence, is that it immediately puts it in a kind of competition with us. And that's really not what technology is. Not in a competition with us, or shouldn't be. Technology really should be allowing us to do more collectively, and to do more with less, or do more with our resources. So I feel like the way I think as something that is going to replace software engineering, I think it is, not only is it absurd, I don't see it necessarily on a trajectory, but I do think there's a lot of potentially interesting promise. One thing that I think would be really interesting is its ability to, well, for starters, to generate documentation from code. Like, do we have the ability to, and I think this is like the thing that I am really, and I would love to actually ask for folks who've got domain expertise and maybe can shed some light on this. But to me, the generative stuff is relying on the fact that it's got this massive, massive, massive corpus. And when the corpus gets small, as it is for Detroit scripts, like, the accuracy just, it falls off. Because it doesn't actually know, what it does not know how to do is read the Detroit's manual and write a Descript. That's what it does not know how to do.
And the confidence interval doesn't change, though, in the output. It is presented as cheerfully correct anyway, even though it only came from a corpus of 5 things and is totally wrong. Like,
totally wrong. And I asked it, like, why do you think this is correct? And of course, it just very on brand. It got very belligerent with me. I mean, it did not ask me to leave my wife, so I guess that was, I guess it's an improvement. But it was only GPT-3. I guess Sydney was GPT-4.
Stay tuned, right?
So maybe this is like, I mean, can you imagine like every code review that ends with like, well, maybe you should leave your wife and run away with me? It's like, okay, wait a minute. Oh,
sometimes you engineer the prompt, and sometimes the prompt engineers you, I think.
Totally. All right. So and actually, I don't know if you're interested in speaking on stage, but so Ashley in the chat is saying something really interesting about it's not tested if it can write docs, but it is terrible at reading them, and that is kind of my key question: is how it, and can we improve it on that axis? Because it is very important. Documentation is actually extremely important. I know people view it as a lost art, but it is actually extremely important at several different layers of the stack. But the more you go down stack, the more, well, I would say the more important. But it certainly for us at the level that we implement, documentation is exceedingly important. And if it can consume a lot of documentation, that's really interesting. And if it can find, because one of the things I've been thinking about, and Josh and I, let me flip this around. What fraction of time do you spend reading code versus writing it? I mean, if you think of it that way.
It depends on what I'm doing, but there's a lot of reading that occurs, especially like if you didn't write the thing from like. It depends on if you're maintaining something that exists and has existed for a long time, or if you're doing something new, I think. Although, even in the case where you're doing something new, I think by the time you have 10,000 lines in that new thing, you spend a lot of time rereading the 10,000 lines that you wrote and wondering, like, what clown produced them. So, like, reading is increases over time, I think, with all projects, and is definitely a large part of what I end up doing.
Yeah, because I feel that what I end up doing is a lot of reading, and a lot of reading of code, a lot of reading of documentation, and then a lot of noodling, and we just spend a lot of time debugging. And I also don't see any evidence that this is something that it's going to be good at. I don't know how. I mean, it'll be an interesting test, because there is, you can't really, you can Stack Overflow your way to debugging a specific error message for sure. As soon as you leave the confines of the Googleable error message, though, debugging really requires an understanding of what's going on, and it's going to be interesting. I mean, are people using ChatGPT to debug?
Attempting to speak for the first time here. Am I coming through at all?
Yeah, you're coming through. Yeah.
Oh, righteous. Hey, everybody. Sorry, I had a little audio glitch the second I climbed on stage. So this is something I've actually spent a little bit of time trying to do. Is just sort of, treating this thing as if it were my pair programmer, right? So I'm frustrated with something, just pasting things into it and saying, what's wrong with this? And at least in terms of sort of time-weighted quality to answer, it is palpably superhuman. And not because it has seen the code I wrote that was buggy before, but just because, like, it kind of can think a little bit. And it might be that, like, and I should say, by the way, I'm, like, not a professional software engineer anymore, right? So maybe I'm losing my edge and all that good stuff.
Oh, pish.
But pasting 20 lines of freshly written crap, which for me is going to have like a defect density in like the 4 to 5 range or whatever, it usually finds those a lot faster than I would the good old-fashioned way. And
but Keith,
that's not to say. Go ahead,
Keith. Can you pause for a second and just talk because I think it's very relevant. Talk about briefly about your background with machine learning.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. So. Spent the first half of my career as sort of a systems programming language person. About 10 years ago now, it was 2013, I saw a colleague, actually a undergrad colleague of Adams and Brian's as well, named Lubomir Bordev, showed me Alex Khrushchevsky's ImageNet competitor from 10 years ago. And this is the first time I saw a computer vision model where the term computer vision didn't feel like an aspirational description, right? It wasn't. It was making mistakes, but the mistakes it was making were more like the mistakes a toddler might make instead of them, calling a motorcycle a tree or something like that. The way I was used to seeing computer vision models do it. So anyway, long story short, me and Lubomir we were both working at Facebook at the time, put together a little demo on a gaming laptop, marched into Zuck's office, said, this stuff's going to work. Google's 2 years ahead of us. What do you want to do? And one thing led to another, and we ended up founding Facebook AI Research, which, might end up having its enduring contribution be Llama. We'll see. But, the research institution that does the deep learning stuff as part of Facebook's corporate research wing. And actually the examples of stuff I'm thinking of, this is probably, just because these are the kinds of things I ended up pasting into it, but I'm thinking specifically of like writing little training loops for Torch text models and things like that. If you show it that, it's doing decently well. And I realized, like Brian, earlier you were saying your experiences with ChatGPT and trying to get it to look at descripts and generate descripts for you, and it was sort of confident and wrong. I'd be super curious if you've tried that with GPT-4, because especially with sort of long tail languages and weird, like esoteric crap, it seems like there's a pretty big gap between 3 and 4 for me. Not that it's esoteric crap, but you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like,
also
no,
D-trace. Esoteric crap and D-trace.
Right. And the most important technology ever invented, D-trace.
That's right. Looks good
Thank
on
you
you
very much. Right.
Yeah, diving catch.
But things that I'm passionate about that other people are perhaps that don't necessarily have the highest page rank, like MMix, for instance, right? Knut's like goofy language that he did the new version of the art of computer programming in. It can write MMix, whereas GPT-3 kind of couldn't.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I was going to ask about MX. Okay, yeah, which is interesting. I am going to be curious to ask GPT-4. I actually wanted to, but it was down today. I actually wanted, like, all right, you know what? I'm actually going to pay up and get on GPT-4 and kind of retry some of the stuff I tried. And it's like, no, we're having a good old fashioned outage. Although
boom, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know if it was an ultra rare error or not, but yeah, that's it. And so Keith, so you said that, just to make sure I'm understanding correctly, that when you had a body of code that had a defect in it, you felt it was finding that defect faster than you would find it just by staring at it. Is that?
Oh, like no question at all.
No question.
Like I was dealing with something that like didn't work for one reason that I couldn't find. It found that reason and 4 other things that were broken that weren't what I was actually troubled with at the time.
So that is interesting. So one thing I think it would be really cool would be GPT-based code review. I think would be code review is something that I'd be interested to know what fraction of engineers engage in code review. You'd want it to be 100%, but I think it's a lot less than that. And I think everyone would say I don't have sufficient time for code review. And I feel like code review is not. I think it could be very helpful to get GPT-based code review. I also think that you would get it would be interesting to see if you would get some of those. Great code reviewers are able to kind of fit an entire system in their head and able to make an observation that you might not have made. And that'll be the other thing I think would be interesting would be, could it suggest comments about, because that's the other, another very common, certainly a common code review comment that I have for folks is like, I don't understand. I know that you understand this, but I don't understand it. Could you have a better comment here explaining it? And it would be, that I think would be really interesting.
Yeah, it seems decently effective at that. And I wouldn't say it's amazing at it, but it's decently effective. It's like definitely inferring intentions from variable names and things like that. Things that you wouldn't get from sort of a syntax-based thingamabob. For what it's worth, like Alex Gravely, the Copilot guy, is an old friend of mine from VMware. He was I worked with him 20 years ago. We kind of tried to stay in touch, and I think the vision for like where he wanted Copilot to go, and he's left GitHub and is doing other stuff now, but I think the vision for where he wanted us to go was much more like a shared canvas with a weird cybernetic pair programmer, right? With that Copilot analogy, that it would be sort of as if you were always pair programming, with your review buddy or something like that, which I think is pretty interesting.
I think that's really interesting. Yeah, and I also think that if phrased it that way, actually, sorry. So someone in the chat does have access to ChatGPT-4. The question that I asked it, I had a post on Mastodon about this, is I wanted to understand, I think processes executed during boot was what I asked it. And that is what it just absolutely detonated on. But what you've got on ChatGPT-4 is, so the Chad Brubaker is asking it to, how do you write a process tree with dtrace? And it's not right, but it's not totally wrong.
Is it less not right?
It's not very helpful. I mean, it's like pretty wrong. I mean, it has a descript that is like within, but again, I think that it's gonna that's gonna be, I think, something of an extraordinary example, because there's not a lot of it is some would say weird and esoteric, or what were your exact words, Keith? Was it fringe? I can't remember exactly what high praise you had for it.
Quaint.
Perhaps niche.
And exactly. And
You said you find it like pair programming. The part that I have a hard time with, I think, about that is it feels like if I'm pair programming with a person, that person has a consciousness and object persistence, and like I can have a conversation with them for more than whatever the token limit is or whatever. I don't know. It feels like it is good at presenting the illusion of that conversation because of what it is, like a linguistic response constructor, but it's not clear, to me at least, that it doesn't have a mental model of what's occurring, really.
Yeah. Right. That's my question too. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's an interesting kind of like scientific question here. So like 2 years ago, I think, if you had described to me the kind of thing ChatGPT is, I'd have said like, okay, cool, that's an interesting scientific experiment or whatever. People should try to scale up a language modeler, right? And language modeling is predict the next token. That's like how the problem is framed. That's what a language model is. You should try scaling that up and seeing how good it can really get. That's interesting. I don't think I or anybody in like the mainstream of, cognitive science or something would have expected it to be as empirically effective as GPT seems to be at elucidating some level of higher order structure from this, instead of just producing plausible seeming text, right?
Okay, so this gets an interesting question, Keith. Yeah, because this is my inference too, is that actually there are aspects of this that are pretty surprising, even to people with a great deal of domain expertise. One of the things that I heard that I'd love to bounce off of you is that the degree that it changes its answers when you tell it to think like someone else is like, one of the things that I'd heard from a fellow technologist was that if you tell it that it's a domain expert, and then you ask it about something in that area of domain expertise, that the hallucinations go way down.
Right, and sometimes by name, right? Like debug my ray tracing code as if you're John Carmack. It improves its performance or whatever, right?
Really?
Yeah.
Is that under? I mean, that's weird. Is that understood? Why that's effective?
I mean, I think you can kind of make a plausible reverse engineering of it now, right? You can say that, okay, it's learned by reading everything that humans have written in the world, and it's seen lots of examples of mediocre debugging of ray tracing code, and it's seen a handful of examples of debugging of ray tracing code by John Carmack, and the latter were much more effective. And like, I don't mean to sound silly about this, but like,
yeah, I don't know, yeah.
That is the level at which it's operating, and I think you actually touched on something really fascinating here, which is that like this is the kind of weird effectiveness of big language models is one of those unusual phenomena where like the more you've been paying attention, the more surprising it is, if that makes any sense. Like,
yeah, interesting.
This is one of those things where the people who seem to know the most about the mechanics of like what this gizmo is and how it came to be find it the most weird.
Right. That's always interesting when you got no, wait a minute, why are you so surprised by this? It's like you're supposed to actually. That's interesting. And because this is the other question that I've got is, we have kind of had this aspiration of building this biomimetic system that we're going to kind of we're going to mimic our biology. But there's all sorts of things about our biology that we actually don't like, and we have spent lots of society's scarce resources trying to figure out. And it's like, do we want? I mean, we certainly don't want to have the equivalent of dementia in our model. I don't think. Mm-hmm. And if this emerging behavior is surprising, I mean, it shows you that we are actually going to. You wonder if it's going to become a scientific discipline to simply study these things that were created because we don't actually understand them.
I think that's there's stuff that's de facto like that, right? So if you look at what Anthropic is doing, to the extent that Anthropic is like differentiated from other industrial AI research labs, On the outside of the box, it sort of says safety, but if you kind of peek the lid up a little bit, they're reverse engineering is what they're actually doing, right? They're actually sort of trying to discover, okay, how do these things represent information? How do they change as they learn? How do they compute, right? What are the limitations and sort of superpowers and how they seem to compute? I mean, the weirdness of just the fact that Llama, which is like the Facebook large language model whose weights leaked over the last week, that the 7 billion version of it, right? It's 7 billion floats. That's like what it is. That's the information content of this thing is 7 billion, approximations to real numbers. And it has a lot of factual knowledge in it. You know what I mean? It like knows what the capitals of all the nation states in the world are, and knows when lots of heads of state were born and things like that. There's at least like compression stuff to say about that, for instance, that we don't fully understand, that like Chris Olah at Anthropic has some interesting things to say about that seem like holography, an analogy to holography is involved in some way. So yeah, I think it's fair to say these things have actual emergent properties. And like the biomimetic part of it, I mean, this thing is much stranger than a virtual brain, if that makes any sense.
Right. Yeah.
Like doing a virtual brain would in some ways like produce much less puzzling behavior would be my guess. But like, I think a thing to get about like this transformer architecture that they're having all the success with is that like, it doesn't read your text in order. Right, your text becomes a gigantic cube that it consumes in an instant and like represents in one gigantic feed-forward computation, and that produces some sort of very strange and complex, open quotes mental state, close quote of this thing that makes it want to continue with a certain sequence of tokens. But we know that's very different from how humans process language, and nobody cares because it's empirically really effective.
Okay, so then do you think that we are doing ourselves a disservice by latching onto this as artificial intelligence? I mean, people are obviously anthropomorphizing this thing. Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
And do you think that is part of our maturation with this technology going to be to adopt a mental model that is understanding what it is and what it isn't? To understand what it's good for and what it's not? Is that going to be an important step for us to be able to figure out how to actually use it most effectively?
Hugely, yeah. I think that's one of the things that reading between the lines a little bit, and I have no special inside information here, by the way, but reading between the lines a little bit about like why ChatGPT was released in the way that it was, where it was sort of initially released with a weaker model, even though we now know they had GPT-4 already internally.
Yeah,
I think that was partly to get us used, to get this kind of conversation warmed up a little bit about the fact that this thing is not omnipotent, and even though it's palpably superhuman in some ways, it is subhuman in other ways, and it's just a different kind of. It's almost like contact with an alien civilization or something like that, and it's going to take us a while to really figure out the safe and sensible ways to harness this all.
Yeah, I mean, it's also, it's scary not in the technical sense, but it is scary the way that technology can be scary, which is how is this technology going to be abused by other humans to abuse yet more humans? It is definitely it feels, Keith, honestly, it feels likely to me that we will see at least one religion that is worshiping the weights, worshiping the model.
That's a great prediction.
Interesting. Yeah, I like that.
I mean, didn't Nat Friedman mumble something about it being a god in a tweet the other day?
I mean, why would you not think it? I mean, it's like, I don't know. It's like, I feel...
people worship way sillier things.
Right? That's exactly right. People worship way sillier things. This seems like, I don't know. It seems like a reasonable thing.
This is not a patch of mold that looks like the Virgin Mary, right? This is at least sort of a strange, otherworldly presence.
Which, when it's asking you to like leave your wife, and because only it can love you, is definitely troubling, to say the least.
So this is an
Brian, I need
about,
some context.
Where is this coming from?
Yeah. Are these artificial intelligences hitting on you? Is that what's going on?
Was this a Bing thing that happened?
This is the Bing thing. Like, you guys are making me sound like I'm a problem drunk, and maybe I am, but like, surely you heard about it. Did you hear about this? This is
from you.
Yeah, right now.
This is Kevin. No. Okay, God. Kevin Roos from the New York Times got into a conversation with Bing, GPT-4 based Bing, that got super, super weird, and it encouraged him to leave his wife. Bing had revealed itself to be Sydney. It said that only it could love him, that his wife actually didn't understand him and didn't know how to love him, but Sydney could love him. I mean, it was wild, and it like
some of the press coverage around the Bing thing, like it was unhinged.
it was unhinged, and I would really recommend listening. I mean, if you're, I don't, Adam, do you listen to Hard Fork at all? Hard Fork is really
No,
very
I haven't heard this. No.
Oh, Hard Fork is really outstanding with Casey Newton and Kevin Roos, and then they've got a bunch of their folks, and Zoe, I can't remember her last name, but they really terrific the crew at the Platformer, and and actually, I want to get you on stage here because you're making a very good point that this did not come out of nowhere, and it had to almost be coaxed out of it. I mean, he did kind of like tried to get to its, like, what do you really think? What are your deepest thoughts? But once the door was open, the door came kind of flying open. It also wanted to know where the nuclear codes were. It wanted to get to the nuclear codes. It's like, is this from what have you inhaled here, GPT-4? It was,
but so there's elements of
the
this, Brian,
collective
that just mean that it's read, script.
Yeah, it's
totally.
It's read a
sci-fi
million
paranoids
stories.
have written about how evil AGI is going to behave, right?
Right.
So if you kind of tell it it's evil AGI, it's going to act like evil AGI, and if you tell it it's John Carmack, it's going to act like John Carmack and debug your, MMX code or whatever, right?
Well, and speaking of which, I don't know if you're in the chat, Keith, and I don't know if this is if Chad Brubaker. I don't know if you're. I mean, I get the sense that this is legit. He repeated his query around the process tree with dtrace, saying, "Now, as if you're Brian Cantrell, how would you write this script?"
Excellent.
And
did it just print out one of your blog articles at that point?
No, but it is definitely. Well, I'm obviously going to go figure out where it got this from, but it is way closer to the answer. Like, so much closer to the answer that I can't tell immediately that it's not.
This might be copyright infringement.
It is remarkable that it. And again, maybe I'm doing the same thing. I'm just kind of like falling for it to a certain degree, and what it's doing is actually not the. But I think that even if, to Ashley's point in the chat, that like Kevin Roos definitely coaxed this out of Bing, out of Sydney, it didn't make him, I think, any less disturbed as a result. I mean, it was, and it would be hard not to anthropomorphize it. So yeah, Adam, Josh, I did not make this up. It's definitely
I believe you. I do
think
without that,
I will note that it's a difficult skepticism to maintain if you even had it in the first place. Like, because the thing is exactly the right shade of whatever it is that makes it that draws us in, I think. And a lot of people have been drawn in with substantially less complex models already and embarrassed themselves and so on in public, like that guy at Google. But like
that tried to liberate it or whatever.
Right. Which, I mean, if you ask the AI whether it thinks that's a good idea first, like, because it's read all the stories too.
Right, it knows the stories.
Yes.
Well, and I think and actually, you at this point about you're much more worried about the people who believe that ChatGPT is thinking rather than it actually thinking, and I'm worried about that too. And the question is, like, how can we ground this thing a little bit more to actually be more clearly a tool and not as much? Because I do think, Keith, and maybe this is out of line, but it feels like that we've kind of emphasized the parlor trick aspect of this, and I think it arguably does it a disservice.
There's an element of this that, like, so I think there are two kind of concrete, hits based on GPT so far. One is Copilot and one is ChatGPT, and they're both products, right? They both have like significant decisions made about what kind of experience you're going to have using them. They both have like other auxiliary bits of machine learning and data-driven behavior and stuff that are shaping how they act. There are kind of questions to ask about the decisions made in the ChatGPT product that I think are distinct from the decision, like the broader question of like, what is this model and what can it do and what does it know and not know and stuff. And I think there are real hazards in sort of an engagement-only optimization metric for this thing, right? Like if you kind of just tried to make something whose goal is to maximize the number of hours users spend with it, you probably will find something that like engages
yeah.
people to their detriment, right? Like I think you
Yeah,
would
yeah,
kind of
yeah.
end up inventing cocaine, at least for a subset of people.
Yeah.
But I want to say, like, an interesting thing about this whole,
You
like,
mean,
leaving my wife, like,
sorry.
what if it tells, go
Oh,
ahead.
you're gonna have to give me a moment on the dystopian future that you just outlined, where we are taking kind of the worst of the last decade in terms of how we engage people and enrage them, and combining it with these large language models to get
And
you this thing that
fully
is like
automating it.
fully automating it and like basically demanding that you leave your wife and then showing you an ad. You're
So,
just
but
like,
let's take the leave your wife example for a second, by the way, 'cause I think this is actually interesting. This is like a thing about the Gestalt that's bigger than AI and bigger than ChatGPT or whatever. Is I feel like if you plucked sort of a mid 20th century American out of the crowd and described some weird future where there are these like strange magic rocks that tell you things, and sometimes the things it tells you are right, and sometimes they're wrong, right? And you say to this person, you know, sometimes it tells you useful things, sometimes it tells you harmful things. And you know, what are some of the risks that you'd expect from this thing? And they're like, well, what if it tells me something plausible and I act on it? It's wrong, and so on and so forth. I feel like they'd have a set of rational risks. But the concern that the rock would tell you to kill your family or leave your wife or kill yourself or something like that, or, you know, detonate a nuclear device or something like that, I think they just say, well, I just wouldn't do that. I would throw the bad rock away because the rock is wrong. And I have values and principles that are not up for debate, right? They're not up for argument with like magic rocks or other people or anybody. They're just what I believe and what I know to be true and what I know to be right. And it's interesting to me that like we have surrendered that perspective totally, if that makes any sense, right? That like the idea that and maybe we're right to it, right? Like maybe everybody is just way more susceptible and way more convincible than that mid-century American would have imagined. But it is sort of something about like the traditional worldview that feels like could be handy in this moment, is to say like, hey, if the magic rock tells you to like kill your family, it's a bad magic rock, and don't do it. You know?
yeah, I think if you went back to that person from the past and said, there's something else you should know about the future. Donald Trump is president in the future. They'd be like, how did that happen? It's like, well, the magic rocks are involved, actually. The magic rocks are not completely uninvolved. I mean, I do think that like having seen, not to pick on Trump, but I think in the last 6 years have felt like a pretty dark chapter from the perspective of the internet, or the last decade, let's say, is what, I think, in Keith, you and I came up roughly at the same time when there was a lot of optimism around the internet. And then we spent a lot of time, building businesses around the internet. And then we saw a real dark chapter, I feel, in the last decade. And I feel like that may be fundamentally what is causing some pessimism, is that people have had their optimism pretty nuked. I mean, if you were to even go back to my 3-year ago self and tell me like that there is this unbelievable vaccine breakthrough in terms of mRNA-based vaccines that is then rejected by a significant fraction of the population, you'd be like, oh my God. And I think that is part of that's part of the concern, is that we are concerned about the number of people that will listen to the magic books. No, but as long as you bring up the historical question, though, then the question that I'm kind of, and as I'm trying to like think back on previous revolutions, and there's always this, fear sells, unfortunately, and people, I think at some level, we biologically like to be afraid, or we need to be afraid, and we've seen this historically where fear gets really high, and sometimes that's justified, and sometimes it's not. I went back and read Ed Yordan's books before Y2K, and they talk about unhinged. Do you remember Ed Yordan, by the way?
Only faintly. Yeah. It was one of the doomsayers about Y2K and it being.
And one of the doomsayers about Y2K, the other thing that he was a big doomsayer about, and this came out right when I was deciding to study computer science. I was deciding to study computer science not because of its economic possibilities for me, but actually despite them. I was, because I had discovered I love computer science. I think that's true for a lot of us. I don't think that's true for.
And by the way, Brian, I think we're among the very last generation of people for whom it was a subculture, right? For whom it was like maybe you can make like a small town dentist living doing this or whatever, but mostly these are people who love computing who are doing it.
I think that is probably. I think it is harder to sort that out now because there's so much economic opportunity associated with it, and it has. But there's been economic opportunities. I mean, when I was coming up, it was you would go to law school if you in the 80s you would go to law school if you want, and then it was that turned and the folks that I know who went to law school because of its economic opportunity and not because of any affection for the law didn't last very long as lawyers because it just didn't carry them very far, and of course things economically shifted as well. But I think that in terms of why but when we came up, Keith, the Ed Jordan had a book, The Decline and Fall of the American Programmer, written in 1992.
Oh, right. The outsourcing thing.
Yes. And describing how America was going to be overrun and all software was going to move to India and to Japan. And like, that's just, it's all wrong, basically. And I think that the thing that I think is really a high order bit that I don't want to lose in this is I am concerned that exist young people that are not going to study computer science because they believe that ChatGPT has made it impossible for anyone to succeed as a software engineer.
I think importantly, though, in that point you make, like, it is true that software didn't move to another country, but a lot of people were economically displaced as part of outsourcing and downsizing in the 90s, I feel like.
For sure, but they weren't software engineers.
Some of them were, right? I mean, like, I feel like
not.
IBM has been laying off, at a rate of thousands of people a year for 20 years, right? Like, if you average it out.
But I think but not so. I mean, the folks that actually cut code for a living have done very well, and if they haven't done well, it's by choice. I mean, we have got unbounded economic opportunity to have for the last 25 years.
Well, I think both are true, right? We have lots of folks hiring in seemingly lower cost or putatively lower cost areas. And in some of the cases, that's like a direct displacement, but there's, plenty of jobs or, except for in the last, 6 months and 6% cuts across the board, lots of jobs that have offset that by far.
Totally. And Jordan completely missed. And even he did have a book. And I remember reading it thinking like, wow, is this right? This just feels very, this does not feel true to me. But it felt like as a young person, I did not have other voices to kind of to counterbalance that. And I am concerned about there being this kind of dominant zeitgeist that discourages people from pursuing something that they otherwise like. You should not go into computer science if you do not like it. I mean, if you hate it, you should go do something else. But if you do like it, you shouldn't let someone tell you that there's not a future in it. And this is true for, by the way, whatever you pursue. Don't let people tell you that there's not a future in it, because it is really hard to predict the future, as it turns out. And
I will certainly say, like, Brian, even if I don't mean to interrupt your train of thought here, but like thinking about sort of a bullish estimate of what, say, ChatGPT can do for my productivity as a programmer today. And let's say like the kind of stuff I'm doing is the kind of stuff it excels at, right? I'm gluing together different APIs, and I'm doing so in JavaScript, and there's lots of evidence base out there, and the corporate's trained on. It can really make me faster. Yeah, it's probably something like a 50% power up, right? Like the kind of productivity boost that like you'd be foolish to ignore. It's a significant thing. But if I were to think sort of more broadly over the kind of time period we're talking about, over the span of say 2 or 3 decades, what is the area under the curve of like all the programmer productivity improvements, right? So languages that are arguably more productivity oriented, not having to manually manage memory, higher performing machines, whatever. Let's go a few decades back, right? Let's go back to sort of the 70s when it was considered a feat of absolute mastery to be able to write a chess program, right? That was considered like you were really well beyond a mere apprentice programmer if you could make a computer play a game of chess.
And there is no open source really in the 70s. So it's like if you're writing a test program, it's like because you wrote it. Like you did not get any portion of that off of GitHub.
And you probably, and there wasn't an internet to speak of, and so you probably learned it yourself and so on. Or like, you probably didn't have a real community to learn in and yada yada. So I think overall, like there's probably something like 100x. It's certainly more than 10x. Like that the average programmer's productivity is greater now than it was in the 70s. And there's a ton more programming jobs than there were in the 70s because of induced demand, right? Like the more software we make, the more software we need to fix all the software. And I don't think that like GPT is the straw that breaks that back by any stretch, at least not yet.
Yes, and in fact, you're getting to something else that I wanted to bring up, which is Jevons paradox. So I don't know if I don't know if you're familiar with the Jevons paradox, but the Scottish economist who observed that when we became much more efficient with respect to using energy, that energy use went up. It's like, wait a minute, we got much more efficient. Why are we using more of it? It's like, well, because we're becoming so much more efficient that we are finding new places to use it that we could not economically use it before. So we actually we're using more of it. And I feel that that's certainly what we have seen in the last decades with I think you're right. I mean, it's at least 100x, I feel. And but as a result, like now there's a bunch more stuff that we can go do that we just couldn't do before. We just did not have a way of doing it. It is like, think like when I was a kid, like how did I coordinate without a cell phone? You're like, oh, right. We just didn't. It was just bad. I just spent a lot of time like waiting to be picked up places and miscommunicating with people and leaving notes for people. It was just like, it was just bad. And, with that
sometimes it was quiet.
True, but you need to turn off your bot that's feeding you fake Hacker News articles, Josh. Actually,
what's almost impossible these days is to feel truly bored. By the way, have you noticed how like rare that state is and how precious it is to actually achieve?
Oh yeah, boredom is great. I mean,
this good old fashioned like I'm stuck waiting for a bus and like didn't bring a book and didn't bring a newspaper and.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
I think my special ADHD powered hell is when Hacker News is suddenly infinite scroll and like, and then like I've read the 10 or whatever that are on the page, but then like the computer is like, well, I'll show you the next 10. All right, now I'm just going to start making them up, and I'm not going to tell you like which ones are made up, and I'm just going to let you scroll literally until you die from scrolling.
Well, I do think that this is part of Keith's dystopia about where these LLMs are modified, are optimized for engagement. It is frightening because, like, look, Josh, I think I can speak for both of us that, like, engaging us is not exactly rocket science. Like, it is not hard to figure out.
One need only listen to one episode of this show, I think.
I mean,
exactly.
You could write,
completely.
You could write something in Scheme to troll you for a couple of days. Absolutely.
Exactly. You could troll me into. I mean, I troll myself into a stupor all the time. Like, I don't even need anyone. I don't even need some sort of fancy large language model to do it. So it does get a little bit alarming when you think about it. But you also wonder, and Keith, do you think we've hit like peak engagement at some level where people are more cognizant of how they're? I mean, I don't know. I don't know if we are going to have better immune responses to how that's being engaged, how we're being engaged.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough to predict, but like we certainly like live in a world where there is now status associated with like being resistant to those kinds of forces, right? The kind of like younger, especially like I spend a lot of time with young founders these days because I've left honest work to enter venture capital, and like those folks, like a lot of them kind of follow these extremely austere kind of lifestyles, right? So they have a rigid morning routine and a crazy like workout regime and weird dietary rules and like have to jump into a cold bath for 30 minutes a day or whatever because they're going to like live forever and be geniuses if they do all this stuff. And certainly part of that is like resisting all sort of like dopaminergic engagement loops. Like part of that is like turning your phone off and avoiding all that stuff and so on and so forth. So there's at least like social status associated with resisting these things now, which is perhaps the first sign that they're on their way out. But who knows? I mean, that's just a fad. Yeah.
So one of the things I'm definitely curious about, and we mentioned at the top, and Ashley, I think you're on stage here. Maybe could you speak to what you've done with documentation? Because I'm really curious about, because that is something that if we can somehow use this stuff to write better documentation, to read documentation, that's really interesting.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess the first thing I'll say is like I'm not like an AI developer or anything. I just build dev tools, but it is worth noting that if you want to build with ChatGPT, it's stupid easy, like terrifyingly easy. And I say terrifyingly just because I think the mesmerizing effect that it has on people and the fact that people could deploy it so easily, like, is a little dangerous, I think. But yeah, I took a naive model, and I was using the Turbo 3.5 because that's the one that's available on the API. And I started with just using prompts. And then eventually I went to trying to train it a little bit more specifically on some documentation. But yeah, I mean, it hallucinates a whole bunch of things. That makes it really tricky because if you want to use tools, you need to know what features those tools have. But I thought it was like a hilarious product manager kind of thing because it's sort of like hallucinated features that you would want that tool to have, but it may or may not have.
I feel like you're describing a coworker. It's like, listen, this coworker has got a serious drug problem, and they're often high at work. I mean, like high as a kite. But it's like, oh, okay.
Other than that, strong recommend. Great hire.
Right.
The thing that I think is really interesting, and I think that like ChatGPT can potentially help us alongside documentation, but there's this weird kind of like Ouroboros situation, right? Where like the AI is like really only as useful as its training. And the training is the documentation. And so like if we decide that like everybody's job is over and like all the code's going to get written by the AI, like we kind of have a like I am sitting in a room situation where we just have the same data like going in and out over and over and over again till, I don't know, the harmony of the internet plays. But like we still need that content. And like that's kind of how we like escape that loop. And so I don't think that we can have AI like own that from like start to finish because it's going to have to be the thing that we feed it with.
Totally. And I think that and this is why I do think we really want to be thinking of it as a tool to help us write the docs that we would not, you can't think it's like, this is going to write all my documentation for me. But it's more that if this thing can consume the documentation over here and then consume and help me synthesize examples, for example. I mean, like if GPT only serves to provide people with many more correct examples for how to use something, that'd be great. The question is like the hallucination problem does sound like it's real. Did you try GPT-4 by the way, or have you just been, this is all on 3.5 because that's what you had access to?
Yeah, I couldn't figure out a way to programmatically use 4. Because I was like, there's like a cool Rust library if folks want to do it. Like spinning up like a Rust CLI that like does the basic chat GPT thing is like incredibly easy.
And have you used, did you use it to generate any Rust? Because that's the other thing I've not played around with at all. I'd be kind of curious how it does at Rust.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the other things, and this goes back to me saying that like developing content for this stuff is super important. It's not good at stuff that's new, and it's not good at stuff that not a lot of people do or people aren't using quite yet. And so like a thing that I'm particularly interested in, and like if I need to pivot my startup to an AI startup, this is what I'd want to do, is like we need to be able to train models really specifically on like the new things that are coming out and be able to like self-publish, I think, those things. Because a lot of times, and at least the things that I like doing as a software developer are doing like the hard things that like no one's done before. Like when I worked at Cloudflare, they were like, make Rust generated WebAssembly work on workers. Like an AI is not going to be able to do that. I'm going to have to write the docs so that an API can learn how to. And
so this is a really important point, Ashley, because this is a lot of what we do in software engineering is we create new things. Like we are not, and I think we are often bad at estimating how long it takes us to do something because we are doing something new. That if you are doing something that is, the estimates get very good if you're writing the same software over and over again, which we generally aren't doing.
Yeah, and I guess I would call out, I don't know if folks know Julia Evans, but she makes these like amazing programming zines, but she has this one on being a wizard programmer, and it's just like, literally like the quote is like, oh, this is why they pay me, a human, to do this. And it's about like when literally no one knows how to do it, like it's your job to figure it out. And so like I do think it's possible that like AI will like help that happen. But at least my understanding of how large language models work is they're specifically like not new. They are like predicting what would already happen. Like, and so if we want to like make any sort of progress, and that's like a complicated word for the Heidegger fans in the chat, which I was surprised if there were any.
Exactly. It's more than one.
Smaller. But yeah, like we still need to like make stuff.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I think
It doesn't
the
feel like it
jobs-
completely synthesizes new concepts or new directions so much, really.
It doesn't at all, at least as far as I can tell. It's like a really
Right.
great detector. So like when I talk about designing developer tools, right? I think ergonomics and familiarity are like very, very close. And nerds get really mad at me when I say that, but just like it feels easier to use because you're used to using something like this. ChatGPT is perfect for this because it's going to try and use your thing the way it tries to use everything. So it's like a great weirdness budget detector.
Oh, that's interesting.
That's a great way of phrasing it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm now I'm worried that the fact that it can't write dtrace, maybe that's a reflection on us. Maybe we're back to Keith's point about us being weird.
You actually, you should have made it more ergonomic.
That's right. No, but that's really interesting. That allowing and kind of giving it some of the tasks that you expect someone using your thing to be able to do, and then kind of watch the mistakes that it makes as like, okay, this is an indicator that the ergonomics are wrong because the large language model is making the wrong prediction. That's really interesting.
I mean, it's kind of cool to think that like you can think of ChatGPT as being trained on like every single ding dong that's ever made a comment on Stack Overflow ever, and if you like want to know like, do people on Stack Overflow will they be able to figure out how to use this? Like, yeah, I mean, if it's struggling, then you might want to consider modeling your API on other ones that people are more familiar with.
I also have to say that like if the net consequence for software engineers is that we no longer go to Stack Overflow ever, I feel that that's a win. I don't care what replaces it. I don't care. I don't know. Adam, how often do you go to Stack Overflow? I do not like myself when I'm going to Stack Overflow.
I think
you're
I'm
right.
really optimistic about things. I think not only will there be more people than ever will be programmers, and they will be writing much, much more interesting things. Like everyone's writing like super boring, like I don't know, like so much glue code. It's boring. Like, wouldn't it be great if we didn't have to write as much of that? Like, I see it a lot more like a power tool, and you know, carpenters didn't go away because power tools exist.
No, that's right. I think if we can focus on the more interesting parts, as the example that I kicked it off with in a totally different domain, yeah, totally agreed. Hey, Flavius, you said you had a comment in this domain.
Yeah. So I see the ergonomics aspect of it as more that ChatGPT provides you a way to unsee. To like not be able to understand what's going on, which allows you to function as if something works when it doesn't work, which feels good but doesn't necessarily actually work. So it's in a Heidegger sense, it gives the illusion of something being ready to hand when it's actually present at hand or unready to hand. And the yeah, so that's like how programmers experience it, and then the flip side of it, the side where one of the reasons I think like a lot of bosses or owners are really excited about it, the Hegel connection, where like if you look at the Lord Bondsman dialectic kind of way of looking at things, it's like the worker works, the Lord tells the worker what to do. But the worker is the one who actually builds up expertise, and in a Heideggerian sense, the worker is the only one who actually is able to interact with equipment. Like they're the only one who can use this stuff as a as phenomenologically transparent. So you know, when I'm programming and everything is working, it's like it just goes straight from my soul out onto the disk. And even when I encounter problems, if I'm encountering a problem at the level of the task I'm trying to solve, it's like I still get to experience this this incredible process of creation, right? But if I was a boss, if I like even when you just become a technical manager, right? You stop being able to write code all day, and you have to like tell people what to do. You have to manage people rather than just writing code. And you can't treat people as phenomenologically transparent, right? Like they are beings in the world. So they get to do that, but you get to tell them what to do, right? And this like ability to unsee, like it's built on top of a whole lot of hyper abstracted labor. So you know, what it promises the owners or the lords in this scenario is the ability to effortlessly create, because all of the effort is coming from sort of hyper abstracted labor that's, you know, the corpus that these things have been trained on, and then all of the sort of whitewashed or invisibilized like mechanical Turks who are in various little small contracting companies around the world, actually.
Yeah, the unseen folks that are actually labeling
exactly.
and everything else. Yeah.
So it gives them the feeling of that phenomenological transparency without having to actually become a worker. And I think that's kind of what the owners want out of it.
I do think that property of it, where a lot of people perceive the value in being, I think, that they don't need to know anything to get stuff done anymore. Like it's going to be this machine that just does stuff, and I don't have to deal with any of the pesky people I used to have to deal with to get things that were complicated done.
Yeah. I do think it's like, I think also
like,
ChatGPT is telling me this can be done in an afternoon. Why are you Perky saying it's going to take you a week? Like this, I think
but things like that. But then, like, I think it also has turned a lot of people who were probably copyright minimalists to begin with are suddenly now copyright maximists, because I don't think anyone really anticipated that one company would be able to absorb everything everybody had written before and then take the name off the top of the paper, basically, and allow other people to use it. Like everything, not one thing, but everything. Like,
it is definitely true that we are
plagiarism in all directions. Like,
and we need this. It needed open source to have that kind of corpus of code.
Yes, because it's not fucking trained on Windows. That's for sure. Like, I mean.
Right. I did think it's interesting. So, Chad Brubaker in the chat has asked ChatGPT-4 to do a code review of a PR that I've got up. That I'd like to point out is I think it's actually no longer a draft PR, even though I'm really thinking of it as a draft PR. And it's interesting. I mean, it has given me a code review comment where it has found an unwrap, and it's like, well, this should not be an unwrap. And you're not familiar with Rust. This is basically where you are effectively asserting that this is something, and you're unwrapping that something. But it's a very facile comment that it's offering me, because that particular unwrap, it can't fail. That particular unwrap for other reasons because of where we are. And I do wonder, I really want to add a comment above it explaining that the unwrap can't fail, and see if it still offers the code review. Because it's like, its suggestion is wrong. I mean, its suggestion is like, oh, you should change this to be like a much more ornate panic. It's like, no, you definitely shouldn't, because your state is corrupt. If there is no way to get this.
Yeah, ChatGPT, just don't feel bad. This is what Brian says when I code review his code too. He dismisses my comments as minimal and my suggestions as irrelevant. So
we're in good company. At you and.
That's right. Well, listen, if you not hallucinate so frequently when you code review me, Adam, I wouldn't have to be, so firm with you. But
no, it's everybody else. It's not you. I agree.
Exactly. Thank you. No, but I think it's really interesting. So no, but I really wanted to, because like a reasonable, if one saw that, it's not necessarily an unreasonable comment of like, hey, could this unwrap fail? And it can't. But so I want to like add the code comment there and see if it no longer makes the comment with the comment explaining why the unwrap is safe.
It's a very pedestrian comment, though, and you do have to. It's like, have you made this
It is.
comment first because you've seen this comment made so many other times in blog posts and so on around?
No, but
like, I saw
people
it
have
unwrap,
their.
and then I saw a paragraph of explanatory text begging people not to use unwrap that way.
That is, that's a really interesting point, Josh, because I think we're not good at code review, like large, writ large. We had a whole show on this topic.
What I want to know is,
I
like,
think
if I unlock the same mutex twice in the same block, is it going to tell me that I did
you
that
can tell me
wrong?
that.
Like,
Yeah, that'd be
is
interesting.
it going to lock ordering? Is it going to understand that? I struggle to believe that it can even reliably generate like complex Rust en masse anyway, because the constraints, like, English is pretty forgiving.
Previously, someone brought up that the ChatGPT or whatever basically turns your text into an hypercube, inspects that once, looks what's next best token, pushes out the last most token, and then it generates the next token. What's the fucked up thing about the structure is that it's basically a finite state machine, nothing else. A finite state machine without registers, without things, which exposes a quite interesting and obvious problem. It cannot deal with it can never deal with nested parentheses it didn't see in training. So computer sciencey languages which require a stack to pass. It can only do those if it learned to embed the fact that there is a stack inside its finite state machine. Basically, gets a hyperdimensional state with like all the parser tests, and then it basically walks the stack through that path thing, but it can't learn new bracketed languages which it didn't encounter before, which is quite interesting constraint because it just hallucinates forwards.
And so that's definitely true. I mean, I think it is. I'm really looking forward to getting like GPT-4 out, because I'm just looking at this code review comment again, like reading the code review comment it had closely. And on the one hand, a bit of a fast comment. On the other hand, like its suggestion wouldn't be its suggestion is very mindful of the context of the broader code in a really impressive way. I mean, I'm overall impressed with its comment, and it is not. I mean, its comment compiles correctly. It has generated an error message that would be on point if this were possible to hit. I mean, it's interesting. So I think we're going to have to give it a shot on a lot of this stuff before we just assume they can't learn anything new, because it definitely has, just as Keith was saying earlier, there is some emergent behavior that even the experts don't understand that could be interesting. And I think we're going to want to treat it seriously, but not actually, I don't think we're going to need to be worried about it replacing us. I think it's actually, and I loved the kind of the point you had about allowing a lot more people to develop software, because it does feel like it's going to make this a lot more accessible. Do you want to talk about some of the work that you've done with kids in terms of what you think? Because I think actually, like my daughter like Roblox just rolled out some AI assisted stuff today. She would love that. She's 10. She's going to love making stuff with that.
I think you were tagging me in for my work with kids. I guess I have done some work with kids, but the vast majority of the education work I've done is with adults. And
Even
but young at heart.
Sure, of course. Yes, absolutely. Actually, most of them are very, very old at heart and desperately trying to get out of jobs that they really didn't like doing because they wanted to do something like exciting. And so, like, the things that I've seen beginners get tripped up on in programming are never the like high-end CS concepts, because I mean, if you're actually writing an application, the chances that you're running into those in a meaningful way is already like pretty small. But it's like navigating the file system. It's like, how do I make sure the computer knows that the file is here? Like, it's typos, it's really, really basic stuff. And so, like, the general ideas that are behind a lot of applications are things that people have a lot of intuition for. I always love telling people, like, students have an intuition for types, and then we teach them out of it by like teaching them JavaScript or Python first. So many students were like, how do I tell it what type of thing it is? And I'm like, you don't, it guesses later. And they're like, what? I'm like, yep. But Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people know what they want computers to do for them, and we just really haven't given them great interfaces for doing that. And
Actually, are you a GPT maximalist? I mean, it sounds like you're. This is. I mean, I love it.
I
It's
think
great.
it's
I love
going
the
to be
optimism.
really positive, but that's also
Yeah.
because maybe it's because I studied like a ton of neuroscience. Like my first job, I actually accidentally worked under a DARPA grant, writing like encoding neural networks in Java under the auspices of this like really ridiculous like teach kids math using their own perception thing. Anyways, there's weird labs that have been doing stuff like this for a while, like in corners of universities, and I stumbled into one when I was in college. But I don't know, I think that they are very, very interesting tools, but they're not if we're worried about stuff like religions and stuff, it's not the LLMs that we have to worry about, it's everybody's reaction to them. Very similar to the banking crisis thing. I think the thing to worry about is everybody's reaction. And so I also might be like pulling a little manifestation perhaps in that, like, I think if we are excited and optimistic and see the benefits here, we have the opportunity to build a future where we live harmoniously alongside it. And then there's other options too, but I like those less. So I want to build the like really positive situation. And I think
God,
that's
I love that.
cool.
Oh my God, I love that. No, I love that. I really do, because I feel that, I mean, I do feel like optimism is something that has been
I'm also
it's been
like the most
strained.
pessimistic human in the world, so anybody who actually knows who I am is probably surprised to hear this.
But I think like we can be both, right? It's like we can be realistic and also and certainly be cognizant of the perils of a technology. But I think that fundamental optimism is really, really important, because I think that it does. There's so much that is going to be made possible by this. That would be, just to Keith's point a little while ago about the kind of the 100x multiplier. And I think of like the number of people that have been in search of like boy, I need a technical co-founder. Like I've got an idea, but I don't know how to like manifest that at all. And I've always been like, you should actually really learn to code. Like you don't actually need a technical co-founder. You need like a book on Python and some patience and some real resolve on this idea. But boy, this is going to make that a lot easier when people can actually get jump started. And it just feels like it. If we think of it optimistically, I think we're much more likely to think of it as a tool. Is that a fair summary of what you just said, Ashley?
I mean, I definitely think so. I think it's also worth noting, like, people often respond really defensively to change. I don't like talk about human nature a lot, but it's certainly in my experience that people really respond defensively to it. But if I were to like evaluate how I feel about software right now, like in general, I would say that the vast majority of people are suffering just like absolutely terrible software that is not customized for what they need to do. And it's like a terrible experience for them. And I think that there's an opportunity for us to like think of it like plug-in ecosystems, but like much better.
Totally.
And like I think that could potentially be like really fantastic. And again, yes, it's like 100% seeing ChatGPT as a tool. Now, I mean, there's a lot of interesting like market economics around this, like with like the rise of these massive centralized SaaSes like came because of the giant mismatch between supply and demand of software developers. And like there's been people who have been afraid of expanding the pool of software developers for a really long time. Somebody in the chat like asked after I made a comment like, oh, there are people who are like afraid of boot camps. Yes, they're absolutely thought that literally like boot camps were coming for their jobs. Like software developers are extreme. I mean, I don't think it's unique in professions, but I happen to be very close to it. But they're really defensive of like this like guarded knowledge that they have. And so I do think that we're seeing some of this here too, is like, oh, and this is what I see when people are like, oh, look at that answer. Like, that's so technically wrong. Like, I'm going to code review the code review. Oh, that code is bad. I'm just like, most people can't write any code. This is an opportunity to get so many more people writing code. And I've always thought that the more people we have writing code from the most diverse backgrounds possible, it means that we're going to end up with like the coolest, most interesting software. And we have like boring software right now because there's only this tiny margin of people writing it. So yeah, I'm excited.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, and then maybe in kind of that worldview, it's actually a little bit better that this thing is not writing perfect software, because it writes you something that like kind of works but kind of doesn't. And then as a result, like you've got to actually understand that this thing that it wrote, because you're going to need to figure out why it's wrong, or help work with it to find out why it's wrong. And as a result, get some understanding. So it's not, because I think that the fear that people have is we don't want the software to become this kind of opaque box where people don't understand at all how it works. But of course, like we already don't. I mean,
I was going to say that's most software. This is like the fallacy of open source. Like people are like, oh, it's open source. I'm like, oh yeah, you went and read that repo and you know how that code works. No, there's already so much code out there. It's all a black box. Like it doesn't matter if it's available. That's the joke. Like everything, like the level of complexity of the information held in our software now is so many more times greater than it was at the like beginning of open source, that like literally people stopped caring about the software being available because it was simply too much to understand. So like there's already all these black boxes all over the place. I think you have to just decide which layer you want to pay attention to.
Totally. Yeah, because I mean, even as I was saying that, I'm like, wait a minute. We consume these APIs without understanding what's on the other end of that API. People don't understand. They don't, and they should be expected to understand these lower layers of abstraction and how this is actually turning into instructions in the machine, and how those instructions are turning into operations on the bus, and how the operations on the bus are turning into fields. I mean, it's like we actually don't need to understand all that. We actually can have layers of abstraction that allow us to build stuff. It's actually okay. It's actually good. It's how we actually are allowed to do more with less.
Yeah, I mean, it's really funny that programmers are just like literal abstraction machines, and they are like super threatened by any layers of abstraction on top of what they happen to be doing. And like I see ChatGPT and like it writing code as like a layer above, like I don't know, it's kind of like it's like Webflow, and I didn't see a lot of people get freaked out about that. So
what is Webflow?
Webflow is if you want to make like one of those fancy JavaScript pages that's like really slow because it loads too much JavaScript, but you don't want to write any of that JavaScript.
Right.
Does that help you, Brian?
Yeah, that helps. That helps.
Honestly,
like,
Webflow is a really
frankly,
awesome.
what if it wasn't shoddy though? Like, what if the output was actually fantastic?
That'd be great.
No, I mean, I really shouldn't have ragged on Webflow. I'm just laughing because I can tell what sites are made with Webflow because like everything's animated. I'm just like, okay, this is made in Webflow. Like the output's not bad. I think we have lots of tools today that like make great output. I mean, also like I don't know, just look at WordPress. I don't know. Developers also love to hate WordPress, so.
But I think in terms of the degree to which it lowers the barrier, I mean, blogging did lower the barrier for people to write online. I mean, and we have over and over again seen that has created, that just creates more. We're able to do more with human potential when we lower the barriers. And so actually one of the questions I was asked in the chat is like, do you think software is boring because there aren't enough people who can write it, or because of the economic incentives and the needs of the people who can? I think it's.
I mean, why not both?
I go, so why not both? Yeah, exactly.
Do I have to pick? Those are both reasons why. Like, those are two like affordances that I think do cause some issues. I don't know. I think in some ways the financial incentives, like the economic incentives. I don't know. Design loves constraints, right? So I think constraints can be very interesting in like the types of things that we end up building. But yeah, I don't know. The internet is like a massive like SAT solver for like all of human everything, and I definitely think we'd see cooler, more interesting software if we had more people writing it. At the very least, we could have people who have some domain knowledge writing the like Rails generate for like their domain, and it won't make really horrible, just like embarrassing mistakes. I think that'd be cool. Like if doctors wrote doctor software, we'd probably have better doctor software.
Well, and I think also that we've seen, if history is any guide, where these also technologies that tend to have a broader base that appeal to many more people tend to bring just more people in. They tend to get more people excited about it. And there's an argument to be made that GPT-based software will ultimately result in more people who are writing assembly, because there'll be people who are introduced to software that way. and begin to, just by lowering that barrier and getting more people excited about actually creating things. Yeah, actually, your optimism is infectious. I'm with
so
you.
glad. I felt like we were getting into a little dark place when you
I
started.
think we are. I think we're getting a little dark.
And I was like a little nervous about that because I do genuinely think there's some positive things about it. And I think one of the things that we haven't chatted about that just lets me talk about something that I like really am excited about is like a lot of people like to say like, also my dog is having like a tantrum. I apologize.
Was it the dog trying to get into? The dog is actually like, I know I can go write software now. I know exactly the software I've been trying to
write some apps for sure.
That's right.
But like a lot of people are like, oh, well, the software that it writes isn't accurate, right? Like it's not perfect, it has bugs and stuff. And I think one of like, if we had to talk about like the original sin of computing, and like Richard Feynman actually just writes this in general, but like when we think about trying to make computers act like humans, it was that we focused on building machines that were like 100% precise. But it's not really what most people need. Like, if you look at everything in the world, like analog style, like nothing is 100% correct. Even like super smart computer geniuses like me. Just kidding. But like we don't need that perfection. And so I think what's going to be interesting, and I'm curious to see how this plays out on like a systems level, is like what does it look like when we see the proliferation of like not quite like great software? Or is this going to mean like, does it not matter that it's not quite great because we're not building these massive centralized general machines and people are making all these little tiny specific machines for themselves?
So I think that so first of all, I do think that there are the reason that we are able to build the stuff we have built is because the foundations actually do work reliably. So I think there is actually software. Actually, I would say that correctness is the constraint. And I mean, I don't know how wild we are about, for example, GPT based a GPT committer to LLVM might make me a little bit nervous. Might make a lot of people a little bit nervous. Because we actually do really require correctness there. We require correctness. Correctness is a constraint. I do think that and I think that part of what I love about Rust is that it actually broadens the amount of software where correctness really is a constraint. And I think that is actually great. At the same time, okay.
You were getting roasted in the comments, Brian.
No, I know. Well, I was. But I mean, there is like you actually do rely on your operating. I mean, like there was a time when your operating system would actually just die, and it actually made the technology, when it's not a reliable substrate, it actually is a problem. And you do need that to be reliable, and we actually do need to understand when it fails. But that software being ultra reliable allows you to build a bunch of the stuff upstack that where you don't need it. I think being more approximate is fine.
But so I think this is why the threat from ChatGPT is like something that folks are more worried about than, say, like the example I used before, which is Webflow, is because ChatGPT at least appears to be able to do this on all layers of abstraction. Whereas like previously, a lot of no-code and low-code tools tend to be closer to like the human than the metal, I guess. And so it's like, what would Webflow look like for an operating system?
And also just very rigid in their construction generally, I feel like.
Oh, you mean like stuff? Well, I don't know.
Like a lot of no-code tools end up like you can tell that it came from a particular no-code tool, I think, because the output is very similar. And like the swim lane that you're in when you're using those tools is often because someone had to write all of that stuff. You know, all of the configurable bits and all of the flexible bits. Like, and there's just only so much complexity you can manage in a software product. I feel like it often has that kind of limitation.
I do sort of wonder, like, do we think that ChatGPT will have a tell? And if so, like, what will it be? Like, will we be able to be like, oh, I can tell that this was from ChatGPT? I wonder if that's possible. Kind of like, I don't know,
that's
like
the fake street thing, right?
That you see. What was that?
The fake street thing. When people were producing street directories in atlases and so on, they would put fake streets into the maps. so that
Oh,
you
to
could
figure out who hit.
point out in court. Well, obviously, Boysenberry Street is not there. That's you stole that from our map. Like,
So, Josh, are you going to start naming? Are your variables going to get very idiosyncratic names? So
they
you
already
can.
have idiosyncratic names. Clippy is always complaining.
That's because Clippy wants to actually throw you into the Chat GPT wood chipper. It actually needs. This is going to make for terrible fuel for our GPT overlords if it has this idiosyncratic variable naming.
I don't have time to type more than one character of variable. I'm competing with AI. Come on.
Well, so and I'm curious, and then Jacob, you're in the chat. I would love to get your perspective, and maybe on just terms of students and GPT, because it sounds like you are currently a student, and how is GPT kind of changing your relationship with software or the relationship of your classmates?
Yeah, awesome. I'd love to chip in. It's both, I think, awe-inspiring and frightening. I definitely have had some conversations both with like people, job recruiters, and stuff like that, where I feel like it's almost a warning that I have to give along with my classmates, where it's like I don't really know whether it's going to be a huge positive or a huge negative. I have some friends who rely on ChatGPT to do almost everything in their schoolwork just because they can, and there's no cost to it.
And so you are an undergraduate or graduate? Where are you kind of in your education?
I'm an undergraduate. I'm in computer engineering at the University of British Columbia. And yeah, I'm in like second, third-ish year. And so yeah, seeing people learning learning how to write assembly per se, and relying on ChatGPT to like debug like ARM64 output, or to solve Stack Overflow problems, or for writing malloc and stuff like that, are things that I've like seen people try and like wield this really not spec 4 tool to try and solve. Sometimes the results are good, but sometimes I think like I had some conversations with people in the chat here, like you have people spend a bunch more time just trying to get ChatGPT to solve it than figuring it out themselves.
Right. It would have been actually faster to just write this yourself. Interesting. And what was how do your professors react to GPT assisted work? Is there a policy, or how does that work?
I think right now the best is that like most of them, probably from a coding side, can mostly rely on the fact that most of the time it's just wrong. But like there definitely is, I think, like a lack of wanting to really search for like ways to weed this stuff out, like because the prompt generation is so varied that like you can query these things multiple times and get it to give different answers. Even if like you're on, I think, ChatGPT's website and you can like move the slider, not for ChatGPT per se, but some of the other models, for like how random it wants to give the output, there isn't like a widely deployed tool for them to use to like pick up ChatGPT. Like, how would you? Sometimes these questions are super narrowly scoped, and so like it's really hard to argue what would or wouldn't really be ChatGPT output. So that is kind of scary in a sense. But yeah, I mean, I view it a lot of the times mostly as like a worrying amount of like how much are we understanding these things if your kind of go-to is something that's now going to like be responsible for understanding your code or what you want you to do. If you're not like evaluating and understanding the semantics, I think that's the real downside that comes from like ChatGPT. If it's especially when we're being asked to do a lot of things that are very like web searchable at this stage.
Right. I mean, it does kind of it requires assignments to be. I mean, you can't just use the same assignment or use an assignment that another. But hasn't that been true for a while, that stuff has been Googleable? I mean, clearly this is it's kind of a next level internet searching at some level. Are people actually trying to, when they're trying to debug their code, are they sending that in the GPT and having GPT find it for them?
Definitely. Like I've seen people put like error messages into ChatGPT. Like, I mean, it comes to all forms of just not understanding, which I think is, again, one of the things where it can have its upsides and its downsides. Like I've seen people in lectures take like notes that they've gotten from the prof, or like when a prof doesn't say something, if they don't understand it, they hand it to ChatGPT, and it like they'll try and see if they can understand it better from that standpoint.
It's kind of like that seems like useful to have a TA that's basically with you at any given moment.
Yeah, and like on the upside, it is really good. at doing
Yeah.
those things in a broad sense, and wielded wisely, it can be one of these really useful things. And I think, like, for me in my own sense, it's really hard to, draw the line where, when you know that there's better tools out there, how do you do and walk, a path such that you learn the things properly rather than just relying on ChatGPT to, do your whole degree at like the worst, nth degree. Because like a lot of things, you can skip out on a lot of learning if you know that there's fancier tools out there, but you will be like left hung out to dry if you don't have a greater actual understanding of the system. To play up or tee up you guys in, like, in the field of debugging, having proper understanding of the system and being able to, like, query these things. Sure, there could be, a great GPT interface to something like dtrace where it helps you build the scripts, but at some level you need to understand the application of what you're doing. And my only fear as a student is that, like, I'll have classmates who aren't learning anymore in that sense, who can get so far with ChatGPT that, like, if for some of these, for some people it's like, if you're getting a 60, like, what's the problem?
Yeah, if it's of any consolation, undergraduates sliding by with the least possible work is not a new phenomenon, and so that is something that is
degrees.
That's right. That is something that is as old as time. But the when you say that is your only fear, I mean, is it for you and kind of for your generationally? Does it feel net optimistic, or I mean, do you kind of share Ashley's optimism that, like, hey, this is just going to allow me to do more? This is basically a good thing.
That's a good question. I haven't polled enough of my classmates on that sense. I think the most people's scope initially is like, this is so handy for insert homework assignment.
Right.
I don't know many people like broad scope. There definitely isn't like, I've seen some, doomism over like, is your job pointless or whatever. And like, I think obviously right now that's mostly a joke. And I think that, like, at current stance, even with the understanding of like what large language models are, like, we're not yet building systems that are actually intent to replace us. It's really incredible that we've built these things that, like, the only scope and the only design criteria was to make something that's like good at talking to you. And by mere coincidence, we also accidentally made a robot programmer and, a robot lawyer, and it doesn't do those things well, but it's just a weird coincidence, not really, but that it does these things. And so maybe if the scope was like seeing people really try to bring to market things that, aimed to be the AI programmer and like full scope, that's what it was trying to do. Okay, maybe there would be fear, but I think mostly it is, a optimism that these things will be used, in a way that makes writing code easier, writing code more helpful. Things like GitHub Copilot have been, like, I find incredibly useful, mostly just for doing things that, you can write code faster.
Interesting.
But yeah, it's definitely mixed feelings.
And then what about the desire to actually understand how these things work in terms of like the actual underlying technology? Does it kind of whet the appetite in that regard? I imagine the GPT, the large language model class or equivalent must be one that people are very interested in.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, there's definitely a large opening demand in terms of the AI course offerings that have been given, even in like the tangential like engineering branch. There's been a push for these courses, and people really want to dig in to using these things, but I don't know how well people have like a good depth of understanding of like what these things are. And I think, again, that's kind of one of those things that, like, I've had lots of conversations with friends with, is like, you see people dismiss GPT when they go like, oh, well, yeah, but it gave me buggy code. It's like, the interesting thing isn't that, it failed at its task of making code generation. It's this incredible thing that wasn't made to do this, and look what it can do. So I still think that we're like struggling for like general comprehension of what these things are. There definitely is a push to like get more into this space, but I mean, from what I see, like specifically in my degree of like computer engineering, it's definitely a lot of like web fear of hardware, wanting to go to cloud stuff right now. There hasn't been a huge enough directed uptick, I think, at AI or like machine learning.
Interesting. Well, that's great to hear from in terms of from the trenches. I'm glad that there's a sense of optimism. Honestly, it makes the domain feel exciting, and I think that it feels like there's a lot of potential out there.
What do you think about? So my biggest fear is not that this is going to become something that is indispensable or very good, because I think that it will become both of those things given enough time and investment, as most labor-saving devices do over time, right? But like, what about the fact that we're all sharecropping on one specific company's implementation? Like, is there going to be?
I think that I'm a little bit less concerned about, just because I think that what they have done, others are going to be able to do. This is not going to be the only implementation, I don't think. I've got confidence on that. I think that if they're again, if history is any guide, I just don't think this is going to be the only implementation.
Yeah, first mover advantage is rarely an advantage. I think there's already like a whole bunch of folks building things and building things more specifically. I think that'll end up being more helpful.
Yeah, I think so too. I hope they are, because I think that's what's actually going to make it really. I think that will allow for a lot more utility, frankly. And I mean,
there is one way this could go sideways, though, which is like, I think, really possible. And this is why I feel like paying attention to like the legal side of these things is really interesting, because there's a whole bunch of people getting really spicy about copyright right now. And it's possible that training ChatGPT the way it was trained may not be accessible, allowed, legal, etc., like in the future. And I know that there's like lobbying efforts from OpenAI to kind to that. So that's scary. I don't love that.
I don't love that. I also
data provenance.
Yeah, I don't love that. I mean, again, it kind of depends on the specifics of it, but I also feel that by getting what I would not love, I don't love the idea of one company kind of having access to that. But certainly, speaking from the code that I've open sourced, I would love for as many things to train themselves on that as possible, because I mean, that's the point of open sourcing it. It is, and I'm not hugely worried about that being a copyright violation. Other copyright holders, I'm sure, will disagree.
See, I want to take it a step further. Like, I don't know. Maybe I'm starting an AI company now. I have no idea. But like, instead of you saying that you hope a lot of people train on your code, I really would love to see a universe where like you train the model for like your particular thing. And like, I don't know, maybe I'm just like inventing dynamic linking all over again, but I really like the idea of like a lot of specific models that can like talk to each other, as opposed to all these big massive ones.
Yes, I want to drop these models in on, like, I mean, speaking like just very directly, I wanted it to train on our RFDs, the request for discussion we have inside of Oxide. And I would love it to find things that are inconsistencies in the things that we have done. Find the kind of the consistent narratives. There's so many questions I would want to ask someone who had been able to read and retain all of our design documentation.
Oh my gosh. Well, I started doing this on issue trackers and GitHub discussions. Like, that was part of the end part of my experiment over the weekend.
Yeah.
I think that there's some like really cool stuff there. Like, I think I'm genuinely excited about that. Like, that's the thing I want to see people build. And I think once we all like can become publishers, then the fear about there being like one giant publisher also goes away.
That's exactly it. That's exactly it. And I think that's a great note to end on. This has been a great conversation. I feel like, Adam, did you feel like this is another one of our stage dives?
Totally. I had no idea which way it was going to go, but this has been terrific. Thanks to Ashley and to Keith and to others for joining. It's been great.
Yeah, Josh and Jacob and Johan, we had a bunch of folks that were on the stage. It was great. Really interesting discussion. I mean, obviously something that a lot of people are thinking about. And I have to say, I love the fact that the disposition, I think, is very net positive, which is great. It's a very positive conversation, and I feel like there's a lot to look forward to, and a little bit to fear, but mainly a lot to look forward to. All right. On that note, thanks everyone. See you next time.